Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Sherrilyn and I'm so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back. Thank you guys so much for your love and support. You know you mean the absolute world to me. I love and I appreciate you so much. I'm pretty sure my eye makeup is uneven. So I apologize if it is driving you as crazy. It's been driving me. I've been f***ing around with it for way too long though, so we're just gonna move on. Okay, for today's case, I feel like this case is one of those cases that it's going to like bring us into the horror season that is upon us with Halloween creeping forward. I came across this like blog or something like that where it listed a bunch of movies, like horror movies that were based on true crime stories. And this was one of those ones that, I mean, to this day, I can still hear like the main line of the movie and it just makes like the hair on the back of my neck just stand up. And it's one of those movies that I like constantly told myself like, oh, don't worry, like it's just a horror movie, like this stuff doesn't happen. And then I find out it was based on a true story. I couldn't believe it. I can't believe sometimes that these stories are real. I've said it time and time again. We have a way of dissociating ourselves to some capacity. I mean, we're very aware that this is real and just horrific, but that's just like human nature to try to want to believe that something like this couldn't happen. And then just reading this story, I'm just like, oh my freaking goodness. What is wrong with you? Let's just jump right into it because I'm rambling and I'm getting all worked up. So today's story is on Janett Christman, and I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie When a Stranger Calls. It has a line in there that is one of the most bone-chilling to this day.
Hello?
Have you checked the children?
What?
Have you checked the children?
I don't know if you've seen the movie, but like quick synopsis and I guess a spoiler to some capacity. It's a story of a babysitter who is babysitting, I want to say like one child. It could be multiple. I can't really remember. I'm sure I've like blocked out some of the movie. But anyway, so there's this babysitter there and then she keeps getting these eerie phone calls. Have you checked the children? And the caller on the other line, like eventually gets more aggressive. Phone calls keep coming and the person keeps asking, have you checked the children? And then eventually she calls 911 and she's like, oh my God, like somebody keeps terrifying me, making these like prank phone calls. I don't know if she asks if like somebody will get sent down there. Probably would have been a good idea. Again, I blocked a lot of this out. But basically what happens is the 911 operator calls back and they're like, you need to get out of the house now. We've traced back the last call and the caller's coming from inside the house. Hell no. So this is one of those movies that I would like repeat to myself over and over when I just like hear that voice in my head at 3 o'clock in the morning when I just like wake up randomly and it's like,
Have you checked the children?
and I'm like, God, it's been like 20 years since I've seen the movie. It still haunts me. And I would just keep telling myself, like, it's just a movie. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. But I was horrified to find out that that movie was actually based on Janett Christman's story. So Janett was born on March 21st, 1936. She was born in Boonville, Missouri, and she was the oldest of 3 girls. I couldn't find too much information on her life with her family when she was in Boonville, but there was a point where they moved to Columbia, Missouri, and the family opened up a cute little diner restaurant, and it actually still stands today and operates. It's called Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse, and then above the steakhouse, they had like an apartment building, so they would just walk up the stairs and have their apartment, and they could go down and work during the day. So the family made decent money, but Janett was 13 years old and she was like at the age where she wanted to have some independence. She wanted to pay things for herself and not rely on her family. And you get that vibe when you look at her too. She looks more mature than somebody her age. That doesn't look like an 8th grader. She just looked like above her years. She's described by everybody that knows her as a very lovable girl. She loved choir. She played the piano. She really liked going to church. A really hardworking, good girl. So one of the ways that she wanted to, make her independence and make money for herself was babysitting. And her family was supportive to the extent that they needed to approve the families that she babysat for, which is understandable. So her parents had only given her permission to babysit for 2 families. And these were couples that they knew relatively well. They felt comfortable if Janett went over there. And those 2 families were the Muellers and the Romacks. So on Saturday, March 18th, 1950, Ed and Anne Romack call Janett and they ask if she can babysit their 3-year-old son, Gregory. She agrees. There was actually even some sort of school party. I don't know if it was a dance. It was some sort of get together with her schoolmates. But Janett was saving up her money to make the last payment on this burgundy jumpsuit that she was wanting to wear for Easter. So she figured this was going to be a good way for her to get money. And so she opted out of going to the party and decided to babysit instead. She gets to the Romack's house around 7:30 p.m. And for this night, it was almost like it was made for a horror movie. It was really gloomy outside. It was pouring rain. There was even like sleet coming down. It was just really eerie and nasty outside. Even the location of the Romack's house kind of just added to that creepy factor. It was quite isolated outside of the city in a newer area that was still like in the rural stages. And the address there was 1015 Stewart Road. When Janett got there, Gregory was already asleep, and Ed and Anne Romack said, he shouldn't be any problem for you. We tucked him in a while ago, and he's sleeping with his radio, which he often liked to do. It was like a comfort for him. So they said, if you hear anything, it's probably just his radio, and as long as that's on, he should probably be good for the night. Anne and Ed were heading to the Moon Valley Villa that night, and they were gonna go play bridge with some friends, and they weren't anticipating being home before midnight. So aware of the fact that they lived kind of on the outskirts and not like an easily accessible area, if Janett needed help, Ed wanted her to feel safe. So he pulls out his shotgun and he tells her how to load it and how to operate it. And he left it by the front door. They also had a rule that if anybody was coming onto the property or driving by and it made her uncomfortable, just to turn on the porch lights. So if somebody was thinking of like casing the area, they knew somebody was home. So after they go through all of that, they leave the house, and the rest of Janett's evening for the next 2 hours is pretty much unknown. And then at 10:35, the police station gets a bone-chilling call. It's from a girl that's screaming on the other end, and she's frantically begging somebody to come and help her. And just as quick as the call comes through, the line goes dead. Now, this is the 50s, so back then, there wasn't like high-tech, fast-paced technology to trace calls immediately. They had to go through like a whole process on a switchboard where that switchboard was located somewhere else, and there was a whole like other operating system with operators who would trace the call and then relay that back to the police station. Since it's not like computer generated, this was after hours. Nobody was working at the switchboard that night, so there was nobody for the police officer to call to try to trace that back. So basically, he's just left horrified, feeling completely helpless that he doesn't know where this call came from, who was on the other line, and he's just sitting there praying for whoever it was to call back again so he has a chance of trying to trace it back himself. About 30 minutes after that call went out, Anne Romack decides to call the house and check in on Janett, make sure everything's okay with Gregory. And she says when she calls the house, the line is busy, but it didn't concern her too much because the phone system that they were on was something called a party line. This was basically an option where you could share your phone line with multiple families to save money. And when I was looking into it, it was definitely an option that I probably would have gone with at that point in time. Not for like the frugality money saving aspect of it, but because I learned that if you pick up the phone and there's like another family on it, you can eavesdrop on their calls, because I'm a nosy bee like that. So I'm sure everybody in this day and age is glad that we don't have party lines, because I'd have like, I think I'd actually have like multiple party lines. I'd pay like the extra, fees. I could have my own like private line for the amount of money I would pay to get on other private lines. But what are you gonna do in those days? We didn't have internet. That's how you got your entertainment. Anyways, I've revealed way too much about my personality. So it was busy, and that's why Anne assumed that it was busy, that it was just another family on the line. So they stayed at the Moon Villa for quite a few hours longer, and they didn't get home until 1:35 a.m. And as they're pulling up, they're like, that's a little bit weird, because the porch light was now turned on. And they had only told Janett to turn that on if somebody came to the house, and they definitely weren't anticipating anybody showing up there. So off the hop, they're just like, okay, like I wonder who came by. And then when they walk into the house, they walk into a nightmare. They find Janett on the living room floor. She is bruised. She's bloodied. You can clearly tell there was a struggle in that room. And she has the cord from one of Anne's irons tightly wrapped around her neck. So they rush over to Janett and they see that it's obvious she's gone. And then naturally, their next reaction is to go up and check on Gregory. They find Gregory in his room. He's exactly how they left him. His radio's still going. He was unharmed, and he slept through the entire attack downstairs. So naturally, police are called, and immediately there is like this pissing match that forms, and nobody seems to want to provide any justice or answers for what truly happened to Janett. I guess the location of the Romax house is like 100 yards from the city line, so it falls into the county that's right next to it. So both of these departments are battling to be the one that like cracks the case and withholds information so they can be the one to solve it faster. And it's so frustrating because in a lot of these situations, if you would just work together and share notes and can compare, you know, like in so many cases when I ask you guys to, you know, share your thoughts and give your theories in the comments, it provides like a different view and things that I wouldn't think of or other viewers wouldn't think of. And we just like, we achieve more together. Come on. We saw this in the Valentine's Day mystery. And because of like this pride and ego, people who are deserving of justice, they don't get it. So that's what happens here. And from the get-go, there's two different theories from two different departments. The first was that the attack happened from somebody who broke into the house and didn't know Janett at all. There was a broken window on the side of the house, and it looked like it was broken by this gardening hoe that was just thrown beside it. There was also some footsteps outside, and then when you crawled in through the window, there was the grand piano in that living room that was right underneath the window. I mean, given at face value like that, it seems like a decent theory, except for the fact that on top of this piano, there was a lot of photos and there was music sheets everywhere, but they didn't look disturbed. Like they weren't like, I guess I said everywhere. They weren't like thrown about. There was just lots of them in like an organized fashion. But there was one piece of paper that had like a smear of mud on it, and it looked to the investigators that it was from a boot. And remember, this evening was really rainy, a lot of sleet outside. I guess there would be mud, but in my mind, I'd feel like there would be a lot of it, not just like a smear. The back door of the house was also left unlocked, so investigators assumed that after, you know, all the effort to get into the house and after the brutal attack and killing on Janett, they just left through the back door so they could get out quick. So that's theory number one. Theory number two, coming from the other department, was that Janett knew her killer. And not only that, they thought that it was somebody that was also familiar with the house. When they saw the broken window and the gardening tool outside, their interpretation of it was that it was somebody that was trying to throw off the investigators and stage the whole scene. One of the reasons for that is that the hoe that was outside was actually never stored outside. Like it didn't come from a gardening shed or anything like that. It was always kept in a utility closet inside the house. And then another reason they thought it was somebody familiar with both Janett and the Romack house was because of the weapon that was used to kill her. The weapon they used was a cord from an iron, and this iron wasn't something that was in open view. It wasn't something that Anne had just left in the living room before she was rushing out the house to go out with her husband and friends that night. This was stored in her sewing room, and so were the scissors that the intruder used to cut the cord off the iron and just use the cord itself. I guess another thing that these investigators thought proved that the whole break-in was staged was that when they actually went deeper in to do like a thorough sweep on the piano itself, they found out from the Romax that it was recently waxed, so it was nice and shiny, like super, super clean, and there was no damage to that surface. There was no scratches or dents or scuffs, and you'd figure like in a haste to get into a house after you've just broken into, you're not going to be like sauntering across the piano. So it just further clarified to them that it must have been somebody she knew, because they went to the extent to like stage this after the fact. And then they find out that when the Romax came home, not only was the front porch light on, but the front door was also unlocked. And when they left, they were very clear, not only like to Janett to make sure that she didn't keep it unlocked, they were the ones to lock the door and make sure her and Gregory were safe inside. Her and Gregory were safe inside. So these are the two theories that they've got going on. Next, they've got to move to their suspects. And finding the suspects, like, it just literally boiled my blood. The department that was focusing on the fact that it was a random break-in and not budging and not wanting to look at anything other than that theory, their focus was just to bring in as many suspects as they could and hope that, you know, it's like out of 100 people, one of them's got to be it. Like, let's just take our chances on all of these random people. But what really frustrated me was that all of the random people that they brought in happened to be Black men. It seemed when I was researching that anybody who was brought in outside of the department, you know, if it was somebody that called in a tip and they were a white man, it was because it was coming from a civilian calling it in, and it was somebody who was expressing a suspicious demeanor. They either had like fresh scratches and bruises, or they were acting weird, talking about the crime. So this was the direction they were going. Not only was it tunnel vision, it was racist tunnel vision. And then the other department, their route was bringing in all of the people that knew the Romax and also knew Janett. Naturally, they start with the Romax because it's their house. Both of them obviously had alibis. They were at the Moon Valley Villa, and then they had friends that corroborated that alibi for them. It sounds like Ann and Ed came back in and out of questioning for a couple weeks' time. I know that Ann had needed to get out of the city, so they got permission from authorities to get her out of the house, and I think she went and spent time with her family. But even during like her stays away, she was still in touch with investigators, trying to help as much as she could. And same goes for Ed. He was very cooperative with investigators, and there was something that both of them had shared separately with detectives that raised red flags, and it was that they both named a friend of theirs who was familiar with the house and also very familiar with Janett. His name is Robert Mueller, and he was the father of the Muellers, who was the other family that Janett had permission to babysit for. Ann and Ed had given their statements independently, but they both had different stories that equally raised creep and suspicion on Robert. Ann's unease with him came from an incident that happened right before Janett's killing. Robert had come over a few days before to help Ann hem a dress. He was a part-time tailor, so he was familiar with, you know, his way around the needle. But Ann said as he was assisting her, he would run his hands over her breasts. I'm sure it was under the guise of him, you know, like doing it for hemming purposes. I don't know if there's any Friends fans out there, but it kind of reminded me of when Ross and Chandler used Joey's tailor and he like cups them, and Joey's like, that's how they do pants. And Janett obviously felt that way too, because she brought it up to the police that it made her uncomfortable. And then when it came to Ed's statement on Robert, it just kept throwing up more red flags. He said that there were several occasions where Robert would make comments about Janett's body, that she had like quite developed hips and big breasts for her age. And he was also the type of guy who would mention his desire to like land a virgin one day. I don't think he specifically said Janett's name, but you know, he would make those statements. You can just kind of sort it together. He fits the theory of not only knowing Janett, but he knows the house well, specifically where the sewing room is to get the iron and the scissors to cut the cord. Because I mean, that's like a specific tool that you're using. Like, you are obviously going in there with a plan. I feel like there's so many items within a house. If you are a random intruder, you're not going to be like, is there a sewing room in here? Because I'm really wanting to see if I could use a cord of sorts to carry this out. And he also knew that there was the utility room in the house that had the gardening tools, so he could stage this break-in with like the gardening hoe. So there's a couple problems. This is just suspicion, so you can't arrest somebody on it. And he happened to be with the Romax on the night of Janett's killing at the Moon Valley Villa, which at face value, you'd assume he had an alibi, except for the fact that he left the club around 9 p.m. and he didn't return until 2 hours later. When he came back, he told the group that he had to leave to go meet a doctor at his house so that he could tend to his son. But when the police questioned said doctor, he said that he had never met with Robert or his son that night. Another strike against him is that the day after the murder, Ed was at his dad's house. He didn't want to be in the home that evening. So Robert called over to Ed's dad's house and he asked him if he wanted to come over and help him clean up the mess and the blood that was at his house, which on the surface seems like a nice gesture from a friend wanting to help you out. Probably not the most pleasant of tasks, except for the fact that the news hadn't broke. Nobody knew what had happened to Janett except for the Romax and Janett's family. If that was not creepy enough, I have more. Robert makes a statement, and for me, me, it's the most chilling of anything that ties him to this. It gives insight to, if it was him that was the killer, how he got in the house. Ed said the two of them were having a conversation after the killing, and he made a claim that he didn't believe the intruder had broken into the house. He said that he thought that would be too loud. It would give Janett a chance to, scramble and try to protect herself or call for help. So he said a very simple way that he thought somebody could get into the house was to just simply go to the front door, knock on it. When Janett answers, the intruder would say something like, "Hey, Ed sent me here to get some poker chips." Like, it just makes you want to cry. Like, it's safe to assume that it's like OJ writing a book. I didn't do it, but if I did it, this is how I would have done it. That's exactly what that reminded me of. So the police department, who has their sights on Robert, they're feeling like even though it's circumstantial, they think they've got enough to arrest him. So 2 months later, they bring him in for questioning. This part really confused me. They didn't actually bring him in for questioning at the station, and I never really could find a reason why. They ended up bringing him to like a random barn, and they questioned him for like all hours of the night. I guess though he doesn't break or admit to anything, and from that point then they bring him to the station and they give him a polygraph test, and he passes it with flying colors. Now, I have my conflicting opinion on polygraph tests. I feel like a lot of people know how to pass them even if they're being deceitful, and that's in like today's day and age. So I don't even know what the quality of a polygraph test would have been in the 1950s. I'm not sure how long they would have had to, figure out all of the kinks in it. So as promising as it sounds for him that, he passed, I don't know what the integrity of the machine would have been at that point when we're in 2020 and it's still not like admissible in court to prove guilt. But the fact that he had passed it allowed him to be released that night, and he wasn't charged. So the next step to try to get an indictment on him was to get a jury together and throw all the evidence at them and see if they could come up with a mutual agreement that they also felt like it was Robert who committed this crime. However, in order to do that, they needed the cooperation of both of the departments together, since they both had an investigation going, and since they were on two different sides of the spectrum, they refused to work together. The jury was seeing two different crime scenes essentially and views on them, so they were just lost and confused, and at the end of the day, it caused no charges being brought forward against Robert because they had nothing to go on that was mutual from both sides. It's just so unfortunate for Janett in that situation because I guess based on somebody's pride and ego, they couldn't come to an understanding just for her. And even though a lot of the evidence that they had was all circumstantial on both sides, there was a piece of evidence that I felt was one that tied Robert as best as it could to being the one that was in there that night with Janett. And that was that Janett had these small hole puncture marks, and they were on her face and on her head. I guess they immediately stood out to investigators because when they were searching the house, they couldn't find anything that matched a weapon that was that small and that distinct. But when people who knew Robert heard about those injuries, immediately they were like, "Okay, this is even more that proves that it's probably him," because Robert was somebody who was known to wear a staple accessory with him with every single outfit, and it was a mechanical pencil that he kept in his front pocket. So detectives bring it in for testing, and even though there's no blood on it to tie it directly to him, it matched the size and the diameter of the injuries on Janett exactly. But again, because these two departments could not come to a mutual understanding, and if we're tying Robert to it and this weapon that he carries on him all the time, it would mean that the first theory couldn't be accurate because they were going based on the fact that it was just a random intruder. So again, nothing happens with this. I don't know what it would have taken, besides him screaming from the top of his lungs that he did it. Because of ego and pride, Janett didn't get justice. And not only did she not get justice, but there's a possibility that a series of rapes and a murder that was almost identical to hers also could have been solved. 4 years before Janett was killed, a 19-year-old named Mary Lou Jenkins break-ins, was also murdered and strangled in her family home. She lived with her mom and dad, and her dad was out of town on work, and her mom wasn't staying the night at the house that night. She was a nurse, so she was tending to an elderly neighbor who lived right next door. I guess her and Mary Lou had some form of like code or way of communicating if there was something wrong. What they would do is they would turn on one of the lights. I think it was like in the corresponding room, like front rooms. So the night that Mary Lou's mom was caring for her neighbor, she noticed that the light that they said to leave on if they needed help was on, but she said she didn't see anything suspicious, like there was nobody outside lurking around the house prior. So she just thought that Mary Lou had fallen asleep with it on. It's not until the next morning that she realizes that there's a good chance Mary Lou is actually trying to send her a message, because she finds her the exact same way Janett's going to be found by the Romax 4 years later. Mary Lou was also beaten and strangled. However, it was with a lamp cord in this attack and not an iron. Mary Lou's house also happened to be just blocks away from the Romax house. Now, the problem with tying Robert to this crime is that this one had technically already been solved. A few weeks after Mary Lou was found, police arrest a man named Floyd Cochran. He was taken into the police station originally after a suicide attempt, and when they were questioning him there, they find out that he killed his wife earlier on that day. And while they're questioning him, it just comes out that he happened to know Mary Lou's father. I guess he worked with him or for him at a junkyard. So they've got his confession on his wife, and now they've got a connection to a crime that they desperately want to solve really fast, because the community is just horrified that something like this could happen to a 19-year-old, and now there's a tie to her. They question him for hours and hours, and eventually he confesses to the crime, even though a lot of the details that he provided to prove that it was him that did it didn't add up. He eventually recants his statement, but a year after he gave that confession, he was executed for killing Mary Lou. One of the main things that makes me question Floyd's innocence when it came to Mary Lou's case wasn't necessarily that he had recanted his statement. I mean, I know that there's always stories of false confessions, and there's also stories of people recanting when they actually did do it. And I mean, he did admit to already killing his wife earlier that day. But generally, when you've caught the perpetrator, the crimes usually stop. And in this case, they didn't. They kept going. There wasn't necessarily a similar murder to Mary Lou's until Janett, but leading up to that crime, there was a series of break-ins and brutal rapes on women, all within the vicinity of Mary Lou's house and the Romax. Aside from Floyd providing a statement admitting to killing Mary Lou, to me it looked like the only reason Floyd even became a suspect and on the radar to begin with was that he had a personal connection to Mary Lou. But so did Robert. Apparently, they went to the same high school together. Mary Lou was a couple grades ahead of him, but I mean, in high school, you know, like you're all kind of mingled together. It doesn't really matter what grade you're in. I feel like at that point, you're all kind of like on an even playing field. And I read that they were also in the same drama club. So I definitely feel that, again, even though it's circumstantial, if they tied Floyd to it just based on him knowing her father, it's worth the assumption that Robert has a possibility to also be connected to it. And then another young girl that he's got connections with 4 years later dies in almost the exact same way. At this stage, though, all of the evidence in Janett's case is gone, and Robert Mueller died in 2006 when he was 83 years old. From what I could read, it sounds like he lived the rest of his life with suspicion. I think there were several times that he tried to charge the investigators for even looking at him and trying to get like an indictment against him, but it didn't go anywhere. Janett just deserved justice, and I think that Mary Lou also did. I really don't think that Floyd was the one who killed Mary Lou. I feel like the crimes were so similar. There was also a connection between the both of them. And in Floyd's case, even though, you know, he killed his wife, it appeared to be a crime of passion, and then he, you know, tried to do like a murder-suicide and then just didn't carry it out. So just based on his story and his initial statement, it didn't feel like he had had this random attack and then killed his wife and then wanted to kill himself a few weeks later. And then even though he's already gone, similar crimes still keep happening. So I feel like even if it's been 70 years, it doesn't really matter. I realize, like most of the people involved in the story are gone, but it doesn't mean that justice doesn't deserve to be served, even if it is to a dead man. It's still an answer and closure for Janett's story. Her two sisters are still alive and well, and her friends, who are all grandmothers now at this point, they still miss and mourn their friend to this day, so they deserve that closure. Sadly, I feel like this one is it's just never going to be solved. It's always going to fall in that urban legend mystery category based on the fact that it just doesn't seem like it's something that can be real. And then there was just no answers to how or who could have done this to somebody. I want to know your guys' thoughts and theories though. I want to know if you guys think that it was Robert who did this or if it was a random intruder. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you so much. I will see you on Saturday and I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon.